Hosta La Vista is brought to you by Green Hill Hostas. And welcome to Hosta La Vista, the podcast where the shade is cool, the leaves are lush, and the friendship's perennial. We are your hosts. I'm Betsy Peterson.
And I'm Mandy Olson, two hobbyist sisters who love this plant as much as you do.
Join us each week as we dig into all things hosta, the plant affectionately known as the friendship plant. Welcome back to Hosta La Vista. Today we are getting into the science behind what can go wrong in a hosta garden and how to recognize it, manage it, and ideally prevent it. We're joined by Brett Arenz, director of the Plant Disease Clinic at the University of Minnesota, part of the same plant pathology program where Hosta Virus X was first identified in the 1990s by Dr. Ben Lockhart. Brett, thanks so much for being here.
Hi there, how you doing?
We're doing good. We're doing good. Thanks for being with us today. Well, let's start at the top. Can you just tell us what Hosta Virus X is and why does it matter to hosta growers?
Yeah, so Hosta Virus X, obviously from the name, it's a virus. Plants can get viruses just like humans and animals can. It's not the only virus that hostas can get, but I would say it's certainly the biggest issue on hostas, certainly in the last few decades. And it's one of the most common types of diseases we see here at the University of Minnesota Plant Disease Clinic. And if you are a very passionate hosta collector and grower, obviously it's not something you want to be introducing into your growing environment and inadvertently spreading around because it can, obviously weaken the plants and lead them to dying and essentially to get to the point where you want to discard them before they actually die, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Can you walk us through what's actually happening inside a hosta leaf when it's infected with HVX?
Yeah, so it's a fairly similar process to what happens when we are infected with a virus. Viruses are not technically living organisms. They essentially are pieces of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, with a protein coat. Sometimes they also have a sort of envelope around them, sometimes not. And they can't do anything outside of their host. They're totally dormant, right? But once they get into a host that they can infect, they're able to more or less get inside the host cell and they trick the host cells into basically using that genetic information that they're introducing into the cell to basically create more viral particles, right? So they're kind of kidnapping the host cell and holding it hostage, more or less. And when it does that, it interferes with the cell's normal processes. And so that's where you get symptoms. Obviously, for a human, that could be weakness, coughing, whatever the sort of tissue is that they're infecting. For plants, it's oftentimes a reduction in chlorophyll production. And so that's why you oftentimes get the sort of characteristic patterns from plant virus infection. And typically with plant viruses that are successful plant viruses, they also have ways of moving from cell to cell once they're inside the plant. So they have these sort of movement proteins that they use to go through the plasmodesmata that the plant cells are connecting with each other.
Okay. So if one, um, let's say you have an infected HVX plant in your garden, and my understanding is it's spread through cut material like a cut leaf or, an introduction basically of something that breaks, I don't know if it's the membrane of the cell, but something that breaks the surface. How exactly does the disease spread within the plant then?
Yeah, so the virus, as I said, it's totally dormant. It does not itself have the ability to penetrate a plant surface. So that's why plant viruses are basically dependent on insects in a lot of cases that either chew on plants or they aphids that have these stylets that basically use them like little straws to puncture plant cells, or through a type of mechanical transmission that you get through use of equipment like cutting plants. Obviously, with hosta, it's the propagation of the hosta where that's is most likely to happen. When you have a big hosta clump and you're trying to divide it, maybe you might take your shovel or whatever and split it in half. And you're rupturing those plant cells. You get some of that cytoplasm with the viral particles on the surface of the tool. And then if you use that, if you just split an infected plant and then you use that within a relatively short period of time, we don't know exactly what the time is, but within that same day, I would say, on a plant that is healthy, then it can be introduced into that healthy plant. Also, there appears to be some said seed transmission of the virus as well, but that's probably not something that's going to be a concern to too many home gardeners, but certainly an issue with the hosta propagation industry.
Tell me what you mean by that. I'm not sure I follow.
Well, most people, when they're getting hostas, they are getting different varieties from a nursery or, specialist company, and then they're reproducing them by just allowing them to grow and spreading them out once they get large enough. They're typically not planting hosta seed. So it's
Oh,
not, yeah, that's sort of what I mean by that.
okay, sorry. I only ask because there are a certain number of hosta lovers that do grow from seed. And so you're saying it is possible to grow HVX infected seed if that came from a mother plant that was infected.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, that could be something they would want to watch out for. At least maybe take a close look at the parent plant to see if it has symptoms.
Okay, okay,
Maybe do some testing.
okay. Yeah, we'll get to that, right? So you work at the plant disease clinic. When a suspected sample comes into the clinic, what does the testing process look like?
Um, so it depends a bit on the type of plant, and then what the client is looking for. Sometimes they have a very specific pathogen in mind that they want us to test for. Other times they just say, my plant doesn't look good. I don't know where to start. Use your best judgment.
Hmm.
In those cases, we oftentimes start with the microscope, looking at the plant tissue really close up to see if we can see visible evidence of either a pathogen or maybe like an insect pest that you can't see without magnification, like spider mites, thrips, and things like that. Um, Sometimes you can identify the pathogen from there just with a microscope, especially some of these fungal pathogens where you can differentiate different spores. Unfortunately, with viruses, you can't see a virus with a microscope. They're too small.
Hmm.
And so you need other means to actually detect them. And one of those tools is something called a serological test. So basically uses antibodies to detect the antigen of the pathogen. Works very much like a COVID test, which I'm sure many people are familiar with at this point, or even a pregnancy test works a very similar way. It's sort of a lateral kind of flow device where you take the plant leaf, put it in some buffer in a plastic bag, kind of grind it up, and then you insert this little paper strip that has the sort of um, antibody sort of put into the right place on the strip. Allow the kind of liquid soaked buffer to flow up the device, and then you'll get a positive line. You'll get two lines if it's positive, one if it's negative. So there's companies that actually produce these tests. One of them is Agdia, a sort of specialist plant diagnostic company. People can, if they want, buy their own uh, diagnostic testing. So if somebody is a real avid, hosta collector and he's really concerned about this, you might want to look
Hmm.
into that.
I've heard about that. Say it again, Agdia?
Agdia, so
Agdia.
Agdia. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is the company that usually is recommended, um, at least in the hosta world, where they say, if you're really concerned. But even I think even if people do get tests, aren't the tests fairly expensive for the
Um,
person?
it's kind of, if you buy them in bulk, they're not too bad. You can get about 25 tests for about $150.
Okay,
So, it can, if you just want to do one test, that's not, you'd be better off just sending it to a clinic. But if you really know that you want to test many plants, or maybe you have a community that wants to go in on a test and split them up, that might could be a way of going about that as well.
sure. We've got a lot of collectors that listen, and I would imagine that if HVX were to show up in a garden that someone had taken decades to cultivate, they might want to spend all 25 tests or whatever testing, all of their plants. But so if a plant tests positive, what should a gardener do next? Let's say they test positive for HVX.
Um, well, there's nothing you can do to cure the plant that's infected. And so you're going to want to get rid of that plant because it's a potential source of inoculum for other plants. And again, this is not something that's thought to be spread by insects. At least nobody has found that at this point. So you really have to think about when did you get the plant? Have you divided it recently? Think back if you did other divisions in that same time period. That's going to tell you a lot about the potential for spread to other plants. If it's a plant you just purchased recently, and you haven't divided it yet, then the chances that your other plants are infected, I would say, would be pretty low. So, that's, I think, a good also kind of side note to keep records. When did you bring things into your garden? And where might they have come from if you do end up having an issue with them. And that's something I think that's going to be true for a lot of sort of disease management issues.
Yeah.
But yeah,
No.
getting rid of it, don't put it in your compost, burn it, bury it, something like that.
Okay. Perfect. So not don't keep the material around in any form. Get rid of it immediately.
Yeah, and it's, viruses generally, we think of them, they're systemic pathogens. So even if you just see symptoms in a leaf, you just kind of have to assume it's also present in the roots because it can go through the vascular material of the plant. So if you want to dig up the whole thing, get rid of the whole thing.
Okay. So what does that diagnosis mean for nearby plants? Are they automatically at risk as well?
Not necessarily. Of course, the biggest thing is that it can only infect hostas. So you don't have to be concerned if it's a different type of plant. If it is a hosta and you're worried about your nearby plants, I would just make a note of it, keep a close eye on them. That would be my biggest thing. It's not really, or at least I haven't seen a lot of reports of like, root graft spreading, things like that. There are other pathogens that do that, especially some tree pathogens, like oak trees, for example. Their roots will actually graft together if there's two oak trees of the same species next to each other.
Hmm.
And in that case, things like oak wilt can spread through a neighborhood over time if those trees aren't removed. But I haven't seen that documented host to my knowledge, so I don't think that's too much of a concern at that point. So I think it's really just thinking about what you have done in the past as far as digging into those plants.
Okay, perfect. So from your perspective, how has awareness of HVX changed over time?
Well, it's an interesting story. I mean, so this was a pathogen that was first reported in 1996 from this department. Dr. Ben Lockhart, very famous virologist, who has just passed away actually a couple of years ago. But he was a tremendous asset when it came to the diagnostic clinic here because he was so passionate about viral diagnostics and really a specialist in a field that there's only a handful of these people in around the world, more or less. And very few people have the know-how and the expertise. We're actually fortunate now that a faculty member at the department now, Dr. Robert Cunjal Alvarez, who started a couple of years ago, was a former student of Dr. Lockhart. So he
Hmm.
was able to pass on some of his sort of institutional knowledge about that. But anyway, a little bit of digression there. So again, reported in 1996. And that's what I mean, scientifically documented, like characterized, done the tests to show sort of how it's transmitted and that kind of thing. Probably existed for some time before that, just sort of unrealized, right?
Mm.
And what was interesting is that there were different hosta varieties which had these viral symptoms, but people thought they were just new varieties, right? And they gave them names like blue
Mm.
freckles, things like that. And
Mhm.
obviously, at a certain point, it was realized that no, this isn't a new cultivar. It's actually a diseased plant that those cultivars had to be, gotten rid of and stopped the sale. Kind of a similar story with, if anyone's familiar with the tulip mania that occurred in the Netherlands in the 1500s,
Oh,
where again, this is a big digression, but with
No,
tulips.
we love these stories. Tell
So
them.
tulips were essentially the Bitcoin in Netherlands in the 1500s. They had
Okay.
tremendous value, people trading these bulbs and things. It was very strange, hard for us to understand now. But if you think of it like speculation, people think they have value because other people think they have value. It helps
Hmm.
you understand it.
Hmm.
And, different varieties, obviously, rare varieties, more value. Anyway, there was this tulip um, streaking virus that emerged. Obviously, at that point in time, nobody even knew what a virus was. So
Hmm.
they just thought it was a new cultivar. And that had enormous value, right? When people started getting these flowers with kind of these interesting color breaking patterns. But the virus was also weakening the plants, and then that would kind of contribute to this whole essentially this huge breaking of the tulip bubble, essentially, where people just lost enormous amounts of money because confidence, essentially, in this whole system kind of broke down, I guess you
Oh
could
my
say.
goodness.
Tulip mania, if anyone's interested, can
That's what
look
it
up.
was called, huh? Interesting.
Yeah. So I don't
Um,
think I got really to the point with Hosta, but that's, it's kind of a glimpse of what can happen.
well, it's still amazing to me even now. Last year we had a guest on the pod who was a Hosta leaf judge, and she was at a leaf show in I don't remember where, and a participant came in with a deeply infected HVX leaf, but was so proud of this. I mean, it was, of course, as big as your face. And she was like, look, this beautiful, look, I've never seen one like this before. And of course, all the judges immediately were like, oh my God. So they had to, of course, try to do some education. And, it's received variously, across the board. This particular person was like, oh, well, I kind of like the way it looks and I'm going to keep it. So I'm going to just keep growing it. And of course, the judges were like, oh, we have failed. Oh, no. But yeah, I mean, it's still very prevalent. And I could see how tulip mania could absolutely take over. Well,
Yeah.
is there ever a scenario where you don't remove an HVX positive plant?
I think it's, just from what you described, if you have some sort of disease garden that you like to maintain because you want to educate other people, but I think it's something that you want to be aware of, and never try to, don't cut into it with
Yeah,
tools, just kind of leave it be. Ideally, not, make sure there isn't any hostas around it. That could be a situation. So I think it's probably the most likely would be a plant pathologist would be maintaining this because they want it as an educational tool or they just are fascinated by those kind of dynamics.
sure. Over time, though, it would probably spread, fairly
I mean,
readily.
not necessarily. If you're not cutting into it, with a tool, it hasn't really been proven to spread any other way. So,
Okay.
if again, if you are somebody that's really passionate about hostas and you're trying to protect your other hostas, just get rid of it. I mean,
Yeah,
don't even mess around with it. But if it's just like a curiosity and hostas aren't your main thing, it's probably not that big a deal.
sure. Except it makes all the Hosta people twitch.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's
Um,
not, people have to realize it's not Ebola, it's not spreading through the air, that kind of thing. So,
yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, moving on from HVX, what are the most destructive fungal or bacterial diseases that you see in hostas? We kind of already talked about HVX. Are there, other things that show up frequently, and are there conditions that tend to trigger them?
that's a great question. There's not too much that we see. Hosta is a remarkably sturdy plant and really pretty tough and hardy if you have, a pretty shady kind of condition that it likes and getting enough moisture. It's a pretty tough plant. I say this as a very amateur gardener myself,
Mm.
who, I do my best but I have tons of oak trees, lots of shade and really kind of high organic matter soil. And hostas are one of the few plants that tend to do well in my very neglectful kind of gardening situation. So it is it's a great plant for beginners, people who are just looking for something that's pretty low maintenance, obviously. And we don't see a lot of very common disease issues on it. As I said, HVX is definitely the most common thing that we've seen in the last certainly 13 years since I've been working here. Get a little bit of fusarium, stem rot, but again, that's pretty uncommon. A little bit of anthracnose. Those are two fungal issues. There is a disease called southern blight. It's another fungal disease that I hear can be a big problem on the hostas, but I have not seen a case of it in Minnesota at this point. I think southern blight, as the name would suggest, is something that's not very common this far north.
Okay.
So, but if you get listeners down farther south, that could be something that's more of an issue.
Yeah, I think I mean it came up on just very recently this week on one of the hosta disease groups, and the folks that live down south were very quick to say, well, it's too early for, I think, southern blight, or is it also called petiole rot?
Could be, yeah.
Could
I mean,
be.
there's
Okay. Probably
It's one of
several
these
names.
pathogens that, in contrast to Hosta Virus X, can actually infect a lot of different types of plants. So probably has quite a few different common names just based on that.
Okay, so actually it's not specific just to hostas.
No, it's going to be something you'll find in a lot of sort of dicotyledonous plants. Thankfully, speaking as a diagnostician, it does have structures that make it a bit more easy to diagnose than some other things. It has these tiny little round, they look like peppercorns more or less if you look at them closely,
Hmm.
like around the soil line. And those are like what do we call sclerotia. It's a specialized fungal structure they use to kind of overwinter and sort of go dormant, more or less. So it's not too hard to diagnose compared to some other fungal issues.
Okay. So the second one there would be the tobacco rattle virus. It doesn't get talked about a lot, but I'm guessing it does show up occasionally from again, just posts I've seen people make. What should hosta growers understand about it, especially when it comes to how it's spread?
Yeah, that's a great question. So tobacco rattle virus, it's a pretty distant second, but it's the second most common virus we see in Hasa in the clinic. And a couple big differences. First of all, it's not just restricted to hosta. There are many other plants it can infect. And also, it's spread by a type of nematode, which lives in the soil. So, people oftentimes think of it as being kind of a soil transmitted virus, kind of mediated through this other organism. So it's not something that is spread through I don't believe it's spread through the propagation process. It's more of the soil. I don't want to say that it can't be spread through the propagation process, but it's not like Hosta Virus X where it sort of only spreads it that way. So that would be something that you definitely would not want to leave in your garden if you had it, because the nematodes that are there, there's a pretty good chance they could be spreading it to other plants in the future.
And what does it typically look like if you have it?
So there are some similarities to HVX, I would say, in that it causes a foliar sort of discoloration or malformation, but it's going to be more of like a ring spot kind of appearance,
Okay.
which is more of a stereotypical plant virus appearance, where you have this sort of circular concentric rings of like light green and dark green. That type of symptom is what I often tell people is really distinctive for plant viruses. There are other virus symptoms, like disfigured growth and kind of chlorosis, which a lot of other things can cause, but the ring spots is really, when you have a ring spot, in some cases you can almost diagnose it visually. So it's going to be more of a ring spotty appearance than HVX.
Okay. And if you have it in your garden, is it the same type of removal as HVX, dig the whole plant up and get it out of there?
Yeah, I mean, all viruses, we kind of assume are systemic. So dig the whole thing up, get out of there, burn it or bury it. Don't put it in your compost. Um, and, you remove that source of inoculum.
Okay. How would um I don't know, I'm just trying to think if how on earth would I know that I had nematodes like that in my soil? Is that I guess that's kind of the next question here. Nematodes do come up constantly. Can you clarify a little bit between the difference of beneficial soil nematodes versus the harmful ones?
Yeah, so nematodes are a really fascinating group of organisms. I would say they're the plant pathogen that people understand the least about, especially, the layperson. Well, times people don't, they say, well, what is a nematode? Right? And, first of all, they're basically microscopic, tiny little worms, like little round worms. Um, there are thousands and thousands of species,
Hmm.
and they're basically everywhere. You're always going to have some type of nematode in your soil. I would say you'll probably always have a plant pathogenic nematode. Um, and if you look out the window and you see all the plants out there, I would say in the most cases, just like all these plants probably have some sort of insect pest munching on their leaves at one point or another. You probably have some nematodes around the roots. Not necessarily this sort of stubby root nematode that is associated with causing HVX, although it is also, a somewhat common type of nematode. Really, the only way to know would be to send in a soil sample to a diagnostic clinic and get a nematode count. So it's a relatively specialized type of test. And typically with nematodes, it's all about numbers. If you have an unhealthy plant and you're thinking, gosh, is this because of nematodes? They have a concept which is pretty similar to insect science called damage thresholds. So essentially, if you just have one insect pest or one nematode, it's probably not doing too much. But it's when you get to a certain number of them in a given quantity of soil, that's when they sort of determine, okay, now you're at the point where if you were a farmer, for example, you would be economically justified in trying to do something about this
Mhm.
population.
My head is spinning.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. So there's beneficial nematodes, and then there are, of course, is the foliar nematodes the ones that are detrimental?
Yeah, foliar nem so just to back up, as I said, thousands of different species of nematodes. They have all kinds of different ecological roles. There are some that eat bacteria. There are some that are parasitizing fungi. There are some nematodes that eat other nematodes.
Oh my goodness.
Others that are parasitic on other organisms, like nematode species that's adapted to it. The only thing they don't do is they don't do primary production. They don't do photosynthesis, but everything else, they're playing a role somewhere in the food chain. It's a very successful evolutionary strategy to essentially just be a digestive system, right?
Are they
And
on
they're
all part of the plant?
mostly in the soil, mostly in the roots
Okay.
is where you'll
Okay.
typically see them.
Hmm.
But I have looked at enough plant material in my life at this point underneath the microscope to tell you that even the healthiest looking plant likely has nematodes in it,
Hmm.
just being part of the ecosystem. And that's not a problem, not going to hurt you. It's just they're kind of a fact of life, right? They're sort of omnipresent around the world. And foliar nematodes are a really interesting one because they're not necessarily, they don't, as the name suggests, they don't attack the roots. So they're kind of an exception. They get inside of the plant leaf and then feed on plant cells, right? Once they're inside the sort of epidermis. And that causes kind of that necrotic sort of lesion on the leaf. So a brown kind of streak. But really distinctive symptom of foliar nematode is that they don't cross the major veins very easily. And so with hostas, you have these parallel veins in the leaves, right?
Hmm.
And so you get this really long brown streak where the foliar nematodes have been feeding and reproducing, and they don't move very easily across where that other major vein is. So that's what we say by vein delimited lesions. It's a really characteristic foliar nematode thing. For the most part, it's really kind of an aesthetic issue on these ornamental plants. So it's not really damaging the health of the plant that much, compared to some of these other pathogens we've been talking about. Obviously people have these plants because they like the appearance of
Hmm.
them, so it can be a problem for people. But that's one way of looking at these guys.
Hmm.
Interesting. Okay. So those irregular brown, they're within the vein leaf, the little brown kind of strips, I guess, between that's a
Well, they're
pretty
between
good.
the veins.
Sorry, yeah, correct. I was doing a bad job of explaining what I was trying, what I saw in my brain. So those are a pretty good giveaway that there's nematodes uh, feeding on your plant or infecting your plant. But what about other irregular brown blotches? Maybe around just the edges of the leaf of the plant. Is that anything to be concerned, or what are some common causes for those?
Yeah, so in that case, it's really good to look at the overall pattern of the brown splotches. If they are basically just all marginal, just on the outside edge of the leaf, it's oftentimes what we call a sort of a scorch or a drought stress type of situation, which a lot of these root infecting pathogens can mimic, can cause very similar symptoms to just like a drought sort of situation, because it's the same thing that's happening, right? The plant's not getting enough water to supply the tissues which are farthest away from the roots. So that would be if it's only marginal, I wouldn't be too worried about a disease. It's really more the cases where it's within the overall kind of silhouette of the leaf, you know.
Okay.
Um, and also, I would say if it appears to be kind of scattered, looking kind of random, you know what I mean? Not necessarily predictable where you find it. That could be more of a like an anthracnose kind of foliar fungal situation. If it has a very kind of regular appearance, like it's between the veins, but it's kind of at a regular distance between the veins, between like all the veins, more or less, on either side of the leaf in the same way. That's really more of like an abiotic kind of indication. It could be like a nutrient deficiency. It could be a phytotoxicity, something like that. But those are some general rules of thumb for trying to separate out pathogen effects and sort of abiotic disorders.
Hmm.
Some of these things
Well,
are a little bit hard to kind of depict on an audio media, but
oh,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
yeah.
we have to have audio visual up here for people to see it. Yeah.
If you know that your plant has one leaf with these nematodes, can you just pluck that leaf off, or is it now in the whole plant? Does that make sense?
No, that would be actually a good thing to do. Yeah, these nematodes aren't necessarily systemic.
Okay.
So, they get inside the leaf, but as I mentioned, they have a hard time moving through some of the major, barriers there.
Okay.
And taking out that leaf, you could be, obviously that's a great start, reducing the overall inoculum. Now, it
Okay.
could be a situation where they are in another leaf, they're just at a low population, they haven't yet resulted in symptoms. So it doesn't necessarily mean the rest of the plant is disease-free, but that's certainly what I would do before ripping up the whole plant, is I would just take
Sure.
that leaf off. And plus, as I mentioned, it's not a huge effect on the overall health of the plant anyway.
Okay.
Got
Cool.
it.
Brett, we like to play a quick game with our guests. And since you're a plant disease specialist, we wanted to change up our Is it a hosta or not segment for one we call Is it a myth or a menace? We will read a statement and you tell us if it's a myth or a real threat, a menace. If you can answer 3 of the 5 correctly, you'll win a prize for one of our listeners. Betsy, who is Brett playing for today?
Brett is playing for Susan Ward of Maple Park, Illinois. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Okay. Number one, you can diagnose HVX just by looking at a plant.
I would say myth overall. Obviously there are things to look for that would make you suspicious, but really for confirmation, you do need to do a serological test.
Okay.
Okay.
Number two, foliar nematodes spread through splashing water.
That's a menace. Yep, that is one of the ways that they're thought to spread. Irrigation systems, spraying, overhead watering. They can even actually swim up the side of the stem if there's freely available moisture on it to get from the soil into an intact leaf.
Oh my
So
gosh. I didn't know that. Okay. Number three, scrubbing tools with a bleach solution between cuts prevents HVX spread.
that's true. That's a very good start for trying to disinfect your tools. You're going to want to like rinse it with water, I would say, after the bleach, just to help prevent the rust from forming from the bleach. But yeah.
Okay. Number 4, southern blight only affects stressed plants.
That would be a myth.
Okay.
Certainly, stress plants in general will be more prone to diseases, but for the real virulent pathogens like southern blight and others, that's not going to be enough to keep them out, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And then the last one, number 5, INSV, which help me out here, had it written down.
Impatiens Necrotic Spot Virus.
That's it. Okay. Only spreads through direct plant contact.
So INSV does not spread through direct plant contact. That's spread through thrips.
Okay, perfect.
All
Well,
right.
Mandy,
You did it. Yes, you did it. You answered 5 out of 5 right. Congratulations.
awesome. Thanks for playing our little game.
Yes.
No problem.
Okay, so next part, we wanted to ask you a little bit about the plant disease clinic. What advice do you see online that makes you cringe a little bit?
We kind of talked about some of them. You mentioned advice to throw away plants at the, initial hint of something wrong, without knowing what it is. Um, I think it would say in general, especially with some of these forums, you see where people post pictures of things, people will kind of chime in with answers, in cases where it's not really sufficient. I think pictures are a good start to kind of narrow down what the problems might be. But just from talking to people over the years, looking at pictures people email us, I would say 90% of the time we can't diagnose it with the picture. We say, these are some possibilities, but really we need to see a specimen in the lab to be able to know more and to have more confidence in it. So I think people are kind of sometimes misled by some of these forums where hopefully by people at this point, people know just because you read something on the internet doesn't mean it's true, but human psychology being what it is, people are really looking for answers, and sometimes not every information source is of the same quality, I would say. Yeah.
That's good general life advice, period, I think.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
if a home gardener wants to submit a sample, what should they send and how should they prepare it?
Well, we do always recommend to send whole plants when it's possible. Obviously that entails sacrificing a plant, right? But if it's you have many of these plants, that might be a doable thing. Because in some cases you might have a pathogen that's infecting the roots, but it's causing a leaf symptom. But if they only sent leaves in, you wouldn't be able to diagnose it, as the pathogen isn't in the leaves, it's only in the roots. So that's always something to consider. And I know, of course, that's not always possible. People have trees and things where they can't do that. Um, if someone is wondering about what to send, they can always call us. They can email us. We can try to direct them to collect a good sample based on what some of the likely things might be. We accept samples in the mail or delivered by hand. Of course, we're in St. Paul on the St. Paul campus, the University of Minnesota. If sending samples in by the mail, this can be a tricky thing because, plants don't always handle mailing that easily, depending on the type of plant. We typically recommend, if people are sending a whole plant in, for example, like put the roots in a plastic bag, tie that off, and then kind of loosely wrap the above ground part in some newspaper, dry newspaper. You don't want to add any additional moisture or anything like that. And put that in a box, so it's not going to bounce around, that kind of thing. That's usually the best sort of way of things getting here. So that kind of prevents the plant from drying out because the roots are covered in the plastic bag, but it prevents it from becoming just kind of a soupy mess if it ends up being in the mail too long, right?
Yeah, true. So if somebody sends something in, what kind of answers or level of certainty could they expect from a diagnosis?
Well, with the pathogens, we can be fairly confident, right? Because we can either see them microscopically or we can test for them directly serologically or by, molecular process looking for their DNA or RNA. If it's not a pathogen, things can be a little bit trickier. If it's an abiotic disorder, that's when things are more, you have to speculate a little bit. So sometimes you might have to ask about, was something sprayed? How long have you seen these symptoms? You might look up, weather history for the property, things like that. So in the case of abiotic issues, um, it's harder to be 95, 100% confident, I would say.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, and we also try to provide, management recommendations with all of our diagnoses.
Okay.
Okay.
That's good. Well, do samples mostly come from Minnesota, or do you see submissions from a broader region?
We get about 80% of our samples from Minnesota. The rest are from kind of a range of states, quite a few from Wisconsin, Iowa. But also, we get samples from California, New York. We have kind of a reputation for oak wilt testing, as well as testing for the garlic bloat nematode. And so those are the two
Oh,
types of samples, which is a whole other different story. But those are the two types of samples we oftentimes get from out of state.
huh.
Never even heard of
Wow.
either of those.
Yeah, I'd say me either.
Yeah.
Huh. So if most of your stuff comes from Minnesota and there are universities in every state, do most universities have some sort of plant disease clinic? So if I lived in Tennessee or Kentucky or wherever, where would I send stuff if I lived not here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I believe at this point, every state has at least one diagnostic clinic that people can submit samples to. We actually have a larger network called the NPDN, the National Plant Diagnostic Network, where we
Hmm.
all, compare notes, have annual meetings, professional development, that kind of thing, collaborate with one another. And so there are some times where like, maybe if someone leaves at a clinic and it has to be closed for a while, but in general, we've done a pretty good job of keeping at least one clinic going in each state. Oftentimes these are associated with the land grant university in the
Mhm.
state. In some cases, the Department of Ag has a lab that people can submit to. It really varies a lot state by state, based on that though. Some of these, some states do offer free testing for people in their state, or like a sort of subsidized, sort of really reduced rate, for example.
Hmm.
Some of them are much more closely aligned with the extension programs in their state, so they can do that. So the funding structures are all really different as well. But it's always a good idea to submit to the lab in your state if possible, because first of all, they're typically the ones most familiar with the common diseases that are the local diseases, I should say. And also, it's not a great idea to be sending plant disease samples all around the country. In fact, we actually have to have a special permit in order to receive samples from out of state and
Hmm.
how we handle them, right?
Mhm.
So, those things put together, when people call us from other states and they're interested in submitting a sample, we say, why don't you check with your local clinic first? It
Hmm.
might be cheaper, that kind of thing. If you still want to do the testing with us, you can send it, or if they recommend, sending to us because we specialize in something, that would be a situation as well.
Hmm.
That's good to know. A lot of our listeners are not Minnesotans, and so, I figured there was probably maybe a more local solution. And it sounds like there is. That's
Yeah.
really great. Good news and great to hear.
All right. What's one of the most surprising or memorable hosta cases you've seen?
Oh, last year I had a really bizarre looking hosta. Maybe you have seen one of these before. It ends up looking kind of like an artichoke.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
it's almost producing a flower that doesn't look like a flower. It's kind of a
Like
combination of leaf and
a
flower. It's,
flowered
it's
scape. Yeah, I think those are interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it's called Hosta fasciation.
Oh.
If anybody is interested in looking it up, you'll see a picture. But yeah, that was a fascinating case. I believe in this case, they were making a phytoplasma test, which is another
Oh.
relatively common ornamental disease, which can make, Aspergillus is a classic phytoplasma disease,
Mm.
if you've heard of that
Hmm.
one. But
Mhm.
it's like bacteria that kind of acts like a virus, and that it interrupts normal plant growth and causes just bizarre looking growth. But in this case, it tested negative. It was just a genetic issue. The plant had something that interfered with its hormone production, so it wasn't growing in the right way. But yeah, it would look pretty strange.
Interesting. Hmm. Uh,
Was there anything wrong with it, or was it just because I've heard of fasciation and it does look really weird. Listeners, go look it up. But was there anything technically wrong with the hosta?
Well, I guess that depends on your definition of wrong. It didn't have a pathogen. Um, but yeah, I mean, it probably was not something that it was a company that was trying to sell the hostas, so they probably just threw them away. I think they were just concerned to see if something was spreading in their
Mm,
stock, you know.
I
Um,
gotcha.
but yeah, it was, and again, I don't know if you had planted the hosta and it died back and came back the next year. Hard to say if it would look the same or if it was just kind of
Hmm.
a point in time kind of thing, you know.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, we hear the term biosecurity. What does that mean for the home gardener?
Um, Normally when I hear the term biosecurity, I am thinking higher level kind of government, agricultural, like food security, especially, you know, when
Yeah.
you're worried about your total kind of crop and commodity production in a certain area, and that could
Hmm.
have a new pathogen coming in, might threaten food resource, or
Hmm.
maybe just has really, strong economic repercussions because all of a sudden you can't export your crop to a country that doesn't have that pathogen because they're banning importations all of a sudden. So I don't know that, it's going to apply too much to a home gardener, at least not with how I typically think of the biosecurity word. But um, if it's a gardener that's concerned about pathogens just in a general way, I would say, just be careful about what you bring in, right?
Hmm.
Look at the plants carefully, be familiar with common viral symptoms, um, and look things over when you're
Okay.
doing the frenzy of shopping that happens in May for everybody.
Mhm.
It's excited.
Well, if somebody is buying and collecting hostas, what's the smartest place to start improving their practices?
Be familiar with the symptoms of HVX, which it can look different depending on the cultivars. So, it doesn't always look the same, which is one of the reasons why, testing can be important. Um, uh, Also TRV, tobacco rattle virus, I would say
Mhm.
one would be good to familiar with. Be familiar with what the rings, like normal kind of ring spot symptoms look like, viral ring spots. Um, if you're not in Minnesota, obviously taking a look at the roots if possible, looking for potential issues there for things like southern blight. But yeah, I mean, just be more careful about what you bring into your own growing situation, especially with like large units of large plant, you know, things, not
Yeah.
not seeds. You can bring in
Okay.
seeds, pathogens as well with seeds, but like potatoes, for example, garlic. People are planting these big chunks of plant material,
Hmm.
and it's relatively easy for different pathogens to kind of hitch a ride in those situations compared to seed, which you can have, seed certification programs. You can be pretty confident they were grown without pathogens and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Okay.
I read an article very recently saying that we're on track to have a big El Nino this year. Is climate change affecting what you're starting to see at the clinic?
Well, I've been working here since 2013, so I guess about 13 years at this point. I don't know if I can safely say I've seen a real trend in that situation. Every year in Minnesota, you're probably familiar. Every year can be very different.
Hmm.
We can have extreme drought, extreme precipitation. We can have really hard winters, which cause a lot of winter damage, especially on our conifers and things like that. We can have years where we get that real cold snap in May or September, the frost damage, so there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of variability between years. I would say long term, in a larger kind of plant pathology view, what climate change does is it changes the environment that native plants have historically been adapted to, and that's stressful for plants, and that makes them more susceptible to plant diseases. It also makes plant pathogens more harder to predict when they're going to be causing issues because it changes, how the environment is sort of typically playing out. So, especially with some of these crops, there'll be forecasting models that people develop where they look at years and years of data and weather variables and how those affect diseases, and they try to build these models for farmers to use to say like, okay, this is the forecast for next week, or here are some good varieties to grow based on what we know about our climate.
Mhm.
When the climate changes, then those forecasting models become less useful. So it introduces quite a bit of uncertainty into everything, which can be hard to adapt to.
Are there diseases or pests now showing up in Minnesota or the upper Midwest that weren't common before?
A couple of ones that we've been looking at in the clinic have been pretty common is it's a fungal disease of lilac called Pseudocercospora leaf blight.
Huh.
And it has been, especially I would say the last 5 or 6 years, been a real head scratcher for people and really making lilacs just look really awful, especially by the end of the year. It's a fungal disease that comes in kind of midsummer, late summer. Again, depends on the year. You get a really wet year, you start to see it maybe in July. If it's pretty dry, you might not see it until mid-September. And then the leaves turn brown. In a lot of cases, people think their lilacs are dead because
Yeah.
you get so much defoliation. But it is a pathogen that's restricted to the leaves. It's not getting into the vascular tissue. It's not getting into the roots. In a lot of cases, the plant has already done a lot of photosynthesis. So how much is it actually impacting the health of the plants? It's kind of debatable. Oftentimes these lilacs look just fine the next year. But, why do people have lilacs? Because they like the way they look. And if they look just like trash for, half the year,
Yeah.
then that can be a concerning thing. So that's definitely one that we've seen more of in the last few years. We're not totally sure why. We don't know if it's a climate issue, if it's a change in virulence of the pathogen. Unfortunately, it's a type of pathogen where it's important in that a lot of people have lilacs,
Mhm.
but it's not quite important enough to get a lot of research funding, if you see
Oh,
what I'm saying. So it's like to do the experiments you actually need to do to answer some of these questions would require some real rigorous, time and money put into it. And lilacs, it's just not. It doesn't move the needle like corn and soybean does in Minnesota.
sure.
Yep. Follow the
Sure.
money, right?
Yeah.
People like lilacs, but yeah, we're
Yeah.
not dependent on them for
And
for a
I
lot
know
of
it's
things.
frustrating for people because they want answers. They want to know, like, well, why don't you know how I'm supposed to manage this?
Mhm.
And all we can say is, well, for similar diseases, this is what people do, but no one's done the study to know what exactly you're supposed to spray and when for this host.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of your armadillo issue, Mandy. Wichita never had armadillos for as many years as I
Oh, yeah.
remember growing up there, but now they're a fairly
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
critter that's come that far north.
Moving north. Yep.
Yep.
All
Interesting.
right, Brett, I promise this is our last game. We're calling this the A to Z Blitz. All right, you've got 30 seconds to name as many plant diseases as you can. No overthinking, just rapid fire.
Yeah, let me want to go.
Ready, set, go.
Ergot, corn smut, wheat smut, leaf rust, stripe rust, stem rust, verticillium wilt, Dutch elm disease, oak wilt, anthracnose, let's see here, soft rot, armillaria, root rot, heterobasidium, root rot. I would say Hosta Virus X, Xanthomonas, leaf blight, Pseudomonas, leaf blight, aster yellows, Spirea stunt,
Stop.
Phytoplasma.
That's awesome.
Wow.
I counted
I
at least
counted,
20.
I was 23. Yeah, good
23.
job.
Okay. Nice.
Wow.
Well
That's great.
done. Well done. We would expect that, right?
Brett, this has been incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it.
If listeners wanted to learn more about the clinic or what you do there, where could they look?
Well, we have a website, PDC, which stands for Plant Disease Clinic, pdc.umn.edu. We have information there on what kind of tests we do, how to submit samples, what our sample fees are. Our email address is up there as well, pdc@umn.edu. Can be a good place to start if you're interested in possibly submitting a sample, if you want to know even if it's worth, um, testing. Our phone number is there as well. So pretty easy to get hold of. We're open year round, 8:30 to 4:30, Tuesday through Friday. And yeah, I would say those are the best ways.
Great.
You can find Hosta La Vista on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also connect with us on Instagram or Facebook, or email us at hostalavistapodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening to Hosta La Vista, and until next time.
Hasta la vista.
Thank you, Brett. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. This is fun.
Special thanks to Green Hill Hostas for sponsoring Season 2 of Hosta La Vista. Green Hill Hostas, home of great new hostas.
Support also comes from Hornbaker Gardens, your destination garden center. And In the Country Garden and Gifts. This is Hosta Country. Visit their website at inthecountrygardenandgifts.com.